we'll go ahead and get started and move along, and then eventually we're going to get into the religions. Right now, this is preliminary stuff, okay? But to me, I find this interesting because when you study these religions, there's basic facts in every religion, and you can relate to them. And this term tonight, the critical issues, the first one is syncretism. It's a big word.
That's kind of what happened.
It's a big word, but being a big word, don't let it scare you. It's just like taking a religion, and let's say this is another religion over here. It's taking both and then forming a new religion in between. And then what happens is with this new religion, it's similar to this, but it may not be the same. And there's people that say, well, no, we didn't do that. But, in actuality, it is, very similar. Now, the next part is that, for example, Baptists are good at this.
We got two audiences here.
Yeah. I'll let y'all finish so I can finish.
I didn't think we started yet.
Yeah, I had already started. Baptists do the same thing. For example, have you ever heard of hard shell Baptists? All right. Have you ever heard of, you heard of Southern Baptists. What's some other ones? Independent Baptists. Primitive Baptists. They're kind of like hard shell. Yeah. Northern Baptists. Free will. There you go. Now watch this. If you look at all of these, they're very similar, okay? But if you broke down their doctrines and what they believe, they deviate from the other one. So to be distinct, to be different, okay? And so they mix. It's the same principle. They they mix the different parts. They can still be called Baptists because they are baptized by immersion. But what they do is they mix stuff. Like the free will believe you can lose your salvation. You have a free will. Hard shell, they primarily have been known for, washing feet. Just kind of one of the things they do. Southern Baptists, we all know that. Independent Baptists, the biggest thing that they do to separate from us is the pastor is in control. He usually owns the property and tells everybody what to do. And the other thing is they don't have any missions they're connected with. They have individual missionaries. And then the other thing is they criticize Southern Baptists and say we take all the money out of the church and we're wasting it. That's Independent Baptists. They didn't like me because I tried to get along with them, but you can't.
Would you say they're legalistic?
Very legalistic. Okay? But what I want you to know is, for example, if you take Hindus, and I'll just put an H here, and you take Islam. Over there in India, there is a religion that comes together, and the two of them are found with beliefs in both, but they'll argue you up and down that they didn't do that. But when you look at their beliefs, you can see a little bit of this, a little bit of that, but they say, no, we're distinctively different. But it's called syncretism. The Jewish people in the Old Testament were bad about this. They would have, of course, what they call Yahweh, worship the Lord. But when they got in around Canaan, they would borrow from the Canaanites and the Baals and different ones, and they would actually mix the two together. And if you study your Bible, you'll find this to be true. The northern part of Israel, where the 10 tribes were with Jezebel and Ahab and those kings and stuff, that's what they did. They built their own temple, and they mixed in Baals and other stuff, and that's what Elijah went up there to do, was to get them to stop that. He said, how long are you going to hop from one side of the fence to the other? You either serve God or you serve Baal. You can't serve both. God's not going to be a God that divides himself. So that being said, one of the things about humans is, since we have a spiritual nature, we're going to worship someone or something, and whatever it is, that's what we devote our time to and our resources and everything else. And, you see it all around the world, same thing. And syncretism is a way, and I often say, well, you get tired of this one, mix a little bit of that and come up with a new one, People are always inventing new religions. They're constantly. And, when I was teaching it, somebody find a new one someone started. Scientology, that's an older religion, but it's not as old as Christianity or anything, but it's been out there for a while. So I just want y'all to understand some of these terms. These are critical issues. The question, why study religion? insight to traditions. If you study religion, maybe you're not a religious person. But if you study religion, you'll learn about the traditions and why people do what they do. You know, the culture, the practices. Insight to sharing religious views. Insight to people. You learn about a person's faith, you'll learn about the person. For example, in America, Christianity is kind of the mainstay for a long time. If you study Christianity, you pretty much can figure out what makes Americans tick. You know, our government, our laws, and things like that. And because it would come from our Christian faith. Tolerance and appreciation, that's critical in religion. Most religions try to teach you to love your neighbor as yourself, as we say in Christianity. But some of these other religions have very, very similar, you know, treating each other with kindness, with dignity, and with respect. And a lot of people don't realize that. Because someone believes different than you, it doesn't mean they may not practice different values and morals than you do. They almost are identical in some cases. And, you know, I find that to be interesting. And when you get into them and we start breaking them down, you'll say, well, that sounds like what we believe. And I say, yeah, but it's a little different. Intellectual questioning and family personal beliefs, those two things can be asked of religion. Some of the religions are very complex. It's almost like you have to be a rocket scientist to understand it. At least I feel that way. Family and personal beliefs come out of one's religion. Marriage, you know, how you raise your kids, who's the head of the home, all of that's based on religion. And you can trace it back. Because if you trace it back and ask yourself, where did all this come from? Well, it came from all the way back to the Garden of Eden. And then afterwards, as man developed religion and beliefs, and then, of course, Christianity and Judaism, the structure of the family is a biblically based structure. If you go, for example, to Africa, they have more kids. They have larger families. They don't believe the way we do, but they still have a nuclear family where they have a father and a mother. He may have multiple wives, but you still have a nuclear family that's based on their beliefs. You know. Anyway, that's just a big word, but it's used a lot in religion. And when we cross it, sometimes I may mix that up. Okay, any questions? Let's see if I can get this done. No, and you don't, because this week they were putting in Comcast and stuff, and she couldn't print that much. So I had to, I'll get you one next week. Is that, everybody okay with that? I didn't want to put too much on Bab. She had a lot on her, and she would have done it, but I said, okay. Okay, what's going on here? It's froze. Turn it off and turn it on? Where'd he go? Yoo-hoo! My pilot is gone. Why isn't it moving?
You're asking the wrong crowd.
Yeah. Oh, come on now. David. Can somebody find David real quick? I know he's here. I'm sorry. He was standing right there looking at me. Do what? Point to the back. It froze up. I can't get it to advance. What about this? How about that?
Monkey see, monkey do.
There you go. There you go. That's the next one. So I can change it now?
Click it again. Hey, cut it off and cut it back on, bro.
All right. How long did I leave it off?
Just a second. Cut it back on.
All right.
All right. Let me worry about it.
Do you think it's a battery?
Maybe. I'll do it. Just holler at me now.
All right. Yoo-hoo. All right. That good enough?
I was going to go to the restroom, but I guess I won't.
Well, when your eyes get to floating, I'll know it's time to go. Take a religious break. Yeah, take a religious break. Okay, here's a final definition for religion. All of that to come to this, okay? Religion is a human activity that satisfies one's inherent spiritual needs and desires. That's kind of a generic religion. It leaves out beliefs. It leaves out values. It don't lean toward Christians. It don't lead toward Hindus. But it recognizes the fact that inherent spiritual needs and desires are part of every human being. They're going to have a hunger for the spiritual, whether they admit it. You're going to go up there and change the battery? Okay. All right, change the next one. Okay. All right, now, the term indigenous. Let's see how much y'all know what does that indigenous mean? Anybody? Huh? Local? Something that's found within a region? Okay. So indigenous for America would be what? Native Americans were some of the original family groups or tribe groups. Native religions is another way of explaining it. So Africa would have indigenous groups. When the missionaries from the Southern Baptist Convention finally started understanding how to send missionaries to Africa, they learned very quickly that rather than send white guys from Southern Baptist churches with speak English, they would send those guys into seminaries and train the African pastors how to be a pastor and and that works so much better. Because, just difference in the races, you got barriers that people have to overcome. You've got language barriers, you got racial barriers, you got, for example, when they first went to Africa back in the, early 1800s when a lot of Americans were going there, the African tribes, because it was so hot, went around with no clothes on, particularly the women. And the missionaries found it offensive. So the first thing they did was to go into a village and say, y'all got to put clothes on. So the next picture you see is they all wearing buttoned up shirts and little shorts on, and the women have dresses on. Well, 120, 130 degree temperature, that just don't get it. And they were used to seeing each other unclothed, but for the American Western culture, that was offensive. And so they spent a lot of time trying. The other thing was they would go into a tribe and a chief might have 12, 14 women for his wives. And they said, well, that's biblically wrong. You've got to change that, and that's the way it's always been. And so they were trying to change their habits and their ways and their clothes rather than trying to teach them about who Christ is and then let Christ do the changing, what needs to be changed. Does that make sense? And that's really in any religion. There's so many factors that go into how people live based on their faith that for you to go in and try to upset that just to make them look like you or act like you, you're not going to ever accomplish anything. But indigenous groups with that, there's three patterns. Number one, human relationships with the natural world. For example, the word, and I'll write this word up there because I know some of you it's hard to see, but I'll put it up here. Animism. All right. And then the other word that's up there, it explains it. Natural animism. Everything has a life or spirit. Humans treat all things with care, kinship between animal and human worlds. So people who practice this, and Africa's one of them. The Native Americans were one of them. These are indigenous groups. They see the entire world, humans and all life, and I'll just draw an ugly dog here, just to represent the animal world. Humans and animals are equal because they both have spirit. Now, not a soul, but they have life. And because they have life and they have blood, those in the indigenous groups believe that the spirit world is in both. So that being said, they almost worship nature itself. Now, they believe in the Great Spirit, but they believe in the spirit world. In Africa, same thing. Japan has some of this and some of their beliefs, that there are spirits in the woods, there are spirits in the trees, there are spirits everywhere. So a person who practices this, like Hindus, some of them practice this, then guess what? And I mentioned this earlier, if there's a bug crawling on the ground, you don't kill the bug. You don't hurt insects. Mosquito land on you, you just try to get him off without hurting him. Because insects, animals, snakes, it doesn't matter. They have spirit, okay? And indigenous groups have that as one of their characteristics. Native Americans, if you read some, like I told you, some of those book I bought on the Cherokee Nation, and I read their history. If you read some of their stories about their animal world, about their life, if they killed a deer, that deer, they used every part of it. The horns, if it was a buck, the teeth, the hooves, the skin, even the tendons, everything on that animal. And they had to go through a ceremony thanking the spirit for that and thanking the deer himself for giving life back to the particular native who killed him into the tribe. So nothing was wasted because that's life. And if a life is taken, then that gives you life. Another characteristic of this is, and this is kind of gross, but it's true. Have you ever heard the word cannibal before? All right. When we hear the word cannibal, what comes to your mind? People eating each other, having people over for dinner, literally. Yeah. If you go back and study where that shows up in our cultures and stuff, it comes out of religious beliefs. They believe, those who practice that if you eat something, for example, you eat a deer, that deer becomes a part of you. Its spirit comes into you. You ate that deer, you ate that bird, or you ate that fish, or whatever it is. The spirit of that animal now lives in you and gives you strength and gives you life. They also believe if you conquer your enemy, your responsibility is to eat a portion of that enemy. Not to stay full. That's not the object. The object is to eat a portion of the enemy in order to gain his spirit into you. You conquered him. Have you ever heard of the dictator in Africa? I think it was, Idi Amin. Idi Amin, on a regular basis, because they had tribal units within even in modern days when he was alive, if he had someone killed or killed someone that was his enemy, he would cut their ears off and cook them. He'd have them cooked for him, and he would eat their ears. And parts of the body that you eat sometimes are significant. When Colonel Custer was killed, General Armstrong Custer was killed, the Little Bighorn, when they found the soldiers that had been killed, the Indians, of course, killed them, but they went back and they sent the women and the children in there. And the women and the children mutilated the bodies. Some of them poked their eyes out, some of them cut their arms off, some of them cut their organs out. And they did this deliberately because they believe in the next life, if they were punished now by physically altering their bodies, then the next life in their spirit, they'd go around without an eye, go around without an arm. And that's what they believed. Because once again, they're an indigenous group, and they believe in that. So cannibalism wasn't a means of trying to eat, to have something to eat, though there have been extreme cases where people may have done that. Primarily, animists believe the spirit of the person comes into them, okay? All right, the next one, David. David, did you get the next one? Okay. There we go. The second one is sacred time and sacred space. Native Americans or indigenous groups have sacred time and sacred space. Sacred time is also called cyclical, a return to the origins for renewal, or it could be called reincarnation. Now, when we talk about sacred time, they look at time different than we do. They look at the 4 seasons, and they see, repetition from each season as the time goes around. So there are times like this. So you got spring, summer, fall, and winter. Things come to life. They're birthed here. They live. They start dying. And then, of course, here they experience death. But then they rebirth or reincarnation. Indigenous groups look at their time like this. So everything's on a cycle. It runs in a circle, okay? We don't do that. We look at a beginning, we're living, we die, and of course we go to heaven. So we're linear. We have a birthday we celebrate, we have events in our lives, we move this way. We're not seeing ourselves going out of existence and coming back as something else. There's a beginning and an end. And that's the reason why the Bible says Jesus is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. So he's telling you right there, as Christians, we're looking at the time the way God looks at time. When time began, there was a beginning for humanity, a beginning for the universe. There's going to be an end, a new heaven, and a new earth. These indigenous groups have time and they call it sacred time, and they look at their whole calendar of events and things that happen and mark their celebrations and everything based on the times of the year and the seasons. Is that pretty clear? All right. The other thing that he mentions there is sacred space. Being a space, sacred space, they have places in their area that they live or in a distance that they consider to be sacred or holy. Okay? That being said, it could be a mountain. It could be a cave. It could be a river. It could be a burial ground for that being said. And what they do, they also look at it as a place where someone, it can be, like I said, it can be a structure or it can be a forest. They also, some of them look at it as an entrance point into the next life. So that in the spirit sense, when they leave this earth, the portal into the next spirit world is through that sacred space. Now, we do that as Christians. This is a sacred space. I mentioned a few weeks ago, some people get upset what you do in this building. The building we had down there, we built it for a gym, but when we kept growing in size, our smaller sanctuary would only hold about 225, and we filled it up twice, and it was still crowded, so we decided to vote to go into the gym, and we set up metal chairs, and we had to set them up every week and set them down, because during the week they played basketball. During the week they had school, and we had basket rims that came down and everything. And then, people got tired of that and, setting chairs up and setting them down, and someone said, let's build a new sanctuary. So we got the plans drawn up. It was going to cost $750,000. We had a bond program. Bond program went, nobody bought a single bond. I said, well, I thought y'all wanted to build a building. So as soon as we got the bond program, we stopped it. And I said, we're not going into debt to build a building that nobody wants. I said, I'm not going to do it as your pastor. It's foolish. We got a building sitting right here. Keep doing what we're doing. Well, we don't like that. I said, I got a plan for you. The doors come in this way. No, there wasn't any doors on the other end. Doors come in on the side. I said, we can put an entranceway on the side, make a building like this, put carpet in, put chairs in, and we can turn this into a sanctuary. It'd still be a skating rink, but we can actually put chairs that are more nicer, comfortable, fix a stage, do the whole 9 yards. And one of the older men said, you know what, preacher, what we need to do is take the whole front end of that building out, create a vestibule, put the bathrooms up both ends. As soon as he could get to saying it, everybody's bing. And we did all that for like $200,000. And it was done. And it was a nice place, wasn't it, Gail? And when we left, they put carpet in, of course. They've redone the stage and stuff. We eventually took the basketball goals out. We put a balcony in. And, we had classrooms up there in the balcony for the school we had. But we made changes, but we saved money. Okay? But that's still a sanctuary. A lot of people didn't like it because it had, at first, 900 chairs in there. We could seat 900 if it was full. And then we lowered it to 700, and we took it down to 500 because it was just too many chairs set up and put down. But a lot of people didn't want to get married in there because it was just too big, and it had a center aisle. And so then we went to 2 aisles, and they didn't like that. They wanted to go. I'm telling you, this is not my first rodeo. I've heard all the excuses. I've heard the whining. But the point is, it's a sacred space. Okay? Christians have sacred space. When we went from the old building to that new building, just first time with the metal chairs and stuff, I had like 30 seniors told me, we'll never come in there. They did, about 30 of them. We'll come to Sunday school, preacher, but we're not coming to church. And someone says, we're not even going to tithe. And I said, okay. I buried a few of those people. And I often said from the pulpit, when you have that attitude here, then take it up with God. Don't take it up with the preacher. I just work for the front office, And so, but seriously, that was their sacred building. Then the old building sat there. Okay, nothing in it. What happens to an old building if you don't use it? Deteriorates quickly. Wires, everything else. And it was an old building. They built it with their hands. Oh, it'd been there since 1959 when Moses crossed the Red Sea. And somebody said, well, my mother was buried in that church. And we had a funeral there. And we had this and we had that. One night in the business meeting, somebody said, we need a building for the young people. Why don't we give them the old building, clean it out, and just turn it over to them, and let's use the building? And everybody looked at each other and said, why not? So they did. And they called it the Refuel Center. And it had old red carpet on it. And then finally somebody said, let's strip the carpet up and go to the old wood floors and have them refurbished. Man, them old wood floors are beautiful. And so they do that to the young people and kids meeting there. They're still using them. A church can do anything if their focus is on God. That was a sacred cow. If I didn't hear one person, I said, we're just sitting there. We did for 2 or 3 years. We sat there with nothing in that building but waiting for somebody to die so we could bury him, in case somebody wanted to get married. And then finally, several of those people that resisted died. And then you just wait for the next generation and you go back and doing, the next level. I say all that to say this. Sacred space is very important in religion. How many of you used to watch Tarzan? All right. Do you remember the Tarzan when they were going through the jungles and the white guys were looking for the ivory and they was going through there and they'd run up on the natives and they'd see skulls sticking up on spears and the natives that were with them would run and say, oh, no, they'd run, because that was a sacred burial ground. It was holy ground. Spirits are there. And so every religion, but mostly indigenous people, take it one step further. They really do. They have areas that, even to this day, that the Cherokee Nation would tell you that's sacred, areas, All right, the next part is respect for origins, gods, and ancestors. Most indigenous religions have cosmic tales of their origins. In other words, like the Native Americans, the Africans, they have stories that they tell to the kids, that the kids tell to their kids, and to the next kids, and in some cases they might write them down. But they're stories about the universe, about the stars, about something they experienced, maybe a star falling, a meteor or whatever. And they have all of those things. In the book, on page 45, Pueblo, and you've heard that before, it means village. And those villages are built high up toward, the gods that they pictured was in the skies above. Another thing is they have a high God, they have a great spirit. Native American, they have female and male. Lesser gods are also worshipped. Ancestors play a role in the good fortune of the tribe. Now, we'll come back to this, but what's a totem pole? You ever seen a totem pole? Huh? It's a little bit like a history. If you go to Cherokee and travel around to you'll see them outside the stores and stuff. They got heads on, look like a bear and whatever, and they got different faces and stuff. That totem pole represents the previous ancestors to that tribe. And so you come up the totem pole, and the one that's on the top is the current, chief. And it traces it back. And they believe that all the spirits of those ancestors are living and are part of that tribe. And that it's up to the ancestor after them to carry on the spirit of the previous ancestor. In Africa, they believe their ancestors are guarding over their tribe. And so they look to them for protection, for provision. In other words, in the spirit world, their ancestors are just alive as if they're in their place, the place itself. So a totem pole is a way to symbolize and visually see the leaders and the spirits of those ancestors. And you've probably watched some of these shows and heard them talk about, the ancestors and stuff. Did he switch it? He did, didn't he? All right. Sacred practices in indigenous religions, you have life cycle ceremonies. You have birth, of course, reach puberty, marriage, or, union with opposite sex, and then, of course, death. And they believe you go to the spirit world and it starts again, okay? Rites of passage that I just mentioned goes with that. Vision quests, burial rituals. One of the things that Native Americans were known for is that part of the coming into adulthood, it was necessary for a young boy, primarily a young boy, was to go out on a vision quest to accomplish a certain feat by himself. It might be to kill a bear and come back showing that you killed the bear. It might be that you go out for 2 weeks and come back with certain animals that you had, conquered. It may be something of that nature, and it would be on the order that you would hunger yourself, that you would go without proper nutrition, to the point where you'd hallucinate. In some cases, they would smoke, certain things and weeds and stuff like that. Peyote is one of them out west that the Indians use to give you a hallucination. Then from that hallucination and your quest, you come back with a story to tell to the tribe. And if it meets the standards of the tribe, then you're accepted into, the next level. So vision quest is often seen in indigenous groups. They do that in Africa. They do it, in the Native Americans and some of the other parts of the world. Burial rituals. Right now, you can go down to Shell Bluff. And I know when I was a Boy Scout, and this has been years ago, there's places down there that probably Native Americans were buried because we dug up all kinds of stuff as boys on the banks of Shell Bluff, arrowheads and things like that. And our scoutmaster said that there were probably some areas around here that were burial grounds that never have been discovered. But you can go to certain parts right here in South Carolina, and they have areas with the mounds, and the bodies are buried and stuff, and you're not supposed to disturb them and stuff. They contain, of course, the graves, but also artifacts, and sometimes valuable artifacts. But there's a ritual how that's to be done. I'm sure you've seen the old Westerns. I know Roger and them watch a lot of Westerns when maybe they're out in the West and the Indians, they come into near where the Indians are and they've got a body up on stilts. And it's up in the sky, and they set it on fire. Some of them they leave where they don't burn. Some they leave open to the birds. They believe that when they die, their spirit is above the ground, so the wild animals can't eat it, but it's okay for the birds to peck the body and for it to rot and the spirit to be absorbed. And then some religions believe the burial ritual, you should burn the flesh. And so the bodies are burned. In India, they put the bodies in the river. They've kind of stopped some of that, but it still is done. Wrap the bodies up and put them in the river. And by the way, if you're a devoted Hindu and your wife, you die, and we'll get to it. I don't know if it's a forest dweller or one of those positions, but if you die, she has to die too. She goes with you. In extreme cases. The British, when they took over there and colonized, India for a while prior to, they stopped some of that. They stopped a lot of the caste system and stuff, but when they got out, they kind of reverted back. But when we get to it, I've got some film somewhere. I'll show you some of that stuff. Taboo and sacrifice is also a part of indigenous groups. What's a taboo? Don't tell me it's a perfume. What's taboo? Huh? It's something that in your religious belief, you've been banned from doing. That's taboo. So you can't do it. And all these indigenous religions believe that if you practice that, then bad magic, bad spirit will come upon you. And it can create problems for the tribe as well as for you as an individual. That's also in Africa, stuff like that. Now, the other part, taboo, and then what's the other one? Sacrifice. Some of the indigenous groups have been known to make sacrifices. If you go back and study, I think it's the Aztecs and the Incas, which are extinct now, human sacrifice was a big thing for them. If you like watching movies about religions and stuff, Mel Gibson produced a movie called Apocalypto. It's not in English, but it shows what the tribes were like among the South American tribes and in Mexico prior to the Spaniards coming to America. It is a vicious movie. And it's about human, it shows the sacrifice, the temples, and all the stuff they did. But they believed that in order for their gods to be appeased, that they had to take a heart from a living person, from your enemy, and sacrifice that person and their heart, and then they would be thrown into the fire. Well, a lot of these primitive and some of these indigenous groups, human sacrifice was a part of their practice. Despite what you may think, and I used to think this way, I always grew up thinking that Native Americans, we call them Indians. Isn't that what y'all call them? We call them hostiles. All right. Have you ever really studied the Native Americans, why they were hostile? Have you ever really studied I just bought me another book. I've read tons of books on the Native Americans. They had a right to be hostile, because guess what? We came across their borders.
They were fighting each other, though.
That's true. That's true. A lot of them were fighting each other. But when they weren't fighting each other, they were trying to defend us away from their lands. And you might say we were the immigrants who illegally came to their shores and took over their habitat. What do you think about that?
Look what we did to them in Trail of Tears.
Huh?
Look what we did to them in.
Yeah, President Jackson set that up for us with the Democrats. You know, they're good at that. I tell you a lot about those stories. But the thing is, you know, that was their culture. They knew how to fight. They knew how to kill. And if you were their enemy, then, of course, they would take you. One of the things, and I didn't know this for a long time, and I always thought that if a boy growing up to be an adult native was going to prove his manhood, he had to go out and kill somebody, you know, like a white guy or something. What they had to do was go out and actually get in combat with something and cut a piece of their hair off. Not scalp them, cut a piece of their hair off and come back safely. Because to do that said you got close enough to your enemy to respect his life and to get what you needed to prove that you were there, but you weren't harmed and neither was he. That was a greater feat. Accountant coup? I didn't know that one. I hadn't heard that word.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. But they had to keep, you know, a lock to show that they got close enough. I thought that's what a baby did, cooed.
I think it's C-O-U-P.
Oh, coot. That's what the Democrats do. It's coot. Yeah. Let's see. Sacrifice, we've already that libation. Libation is a liquid. It could be blood. It could be wine. It could be another liquid or something like that. Food, cannibalism involving human sacrifice and to appease the gods was part of it. Shamanism, trance and spiritual powers. Now, here's a good word because a lot of the indigenous groups at the head of the tribe, you know, you've heard them called medicine men, right? And they had medicine men in African tribes. But the guy who was in head of all that was called a shaman. And that's another word for, you might say, among Jews and Christians, a priest. So he's the religious figure that handles the spell casting, the prevention of spells. He's also involved in the health because they believe the spirits are out of whack and all this stuff. So the shaman plays a major role in the spiritual atmosphere of the tribes. He would be called upon if they were getting ready to go into battle, maybe to read the chicken bones or to read some other animal parts or the insides, internals of an animal. That was done throughout history where people cut animals open, the way the organs lined up and everything else, and the priest would turn around and say, yeah, go fight. And they would say, I wouldn't go right now if I was you. I don't know how to get that out of this body parts, but they do. A shaman was very important to a tribe and almost essential. And so if you took a shaman out, you essentially destroyed their religion for a while. Not completely, but you messed it up because he was the one who gave them the motivation to do what they do. Let's see. Sometimes they utilize, what did I got up there? Fragrance? What is that? Trances. To communicate. Drug substances are used to accentuate the trance. Cannabis, which is marijuana, peyote, cactus, coca, opium. Some use calumet with a pipe. You saw them smoking the peace pipe. That wasn't smoking tobacco. That's actually smoking something to get you high. And so to smoke a peace pipe was to mean that you were smoking dope, I guess, you know. But do what? Smiling while you. It's probably either that or they've been sitting in where the ants were, you know, in South Carolina, and had to get up and dance. Go to the next one there, David. Spiritual powers. We're still on the indigenous religions. Magic, good magic, and magic is also bad. Now, I don't know that this particular. Let me stop for a moment. When you study religion, there's different ways to approach it. We're looking at the different religion and some of the backgrounds. You can actually go back and study religion from the cults and things. For example, Harry Potter, you know, has been popular in reading literature. Everybody, you know, for a long time there, the lady was writing these books. One after another, she got filthy rich. Then they started making the movies, you know. Harry Potter is an introduction to witchcraft and magic. I call it Witchcraft and Magic 101 because it introduced the world into the kids that's fantastical, fantasy, but in actuality, some of those things people actually believe and practice. Whether they have real power now, it depends on the individual, one's interpretation. But her writing all of these books exposed a modern generation, Western civilization primarily, to that kind of literature. I wouldn't ban the books, but I would caution kids if they read them that they need to be aware that, you know, that this is fantasy and this should not be taken. But if they went one step further, they would discover there's actual beliefs that fit in with Harry Potter books. When they first came out, you know, a lot of people in my church were asking me questions and stuff, and I've never seen one of the movies, I never read one of the books, but I've read the information about her and about her books and where she got her information from, and she borrowed right from the occult, and she created the fantasy stories using the occult stuff. It gives the kids a sense of empowerment that, you know, good magic, and we'll come to this later, good magic is something that you can do that would benefit the person, but it's still magic. It's still a spell. Bad magic is when you actually try to harm someone with the spell that you're participating in, and the intent is to cause harm and even death. Down in the Caribbean, it takes on a little different culture with, you know, comes out of Africa, the voodoo and stuff, and you have those. Did y'all see those movies, Weekend with Bernie's? Did you ever see those? Well, in that movie, they brought out voodoo, that you can put a spell on somebody, and even though they're dead, they can still go around. And Charleston has a lot of this among the black culture. They believe in the haints. We had a black kid who was a football player, stayed with Scott, my son, and Scott found out that, you know, what a haint was, and so he started picking at him. And he told him that, you know, there was a haint outside the window and all this stuff. Had him all spooked out. And I said, Scott, you shouldn't do that. So when Scott went off to Greenville and goofed off while he was up there, doing Halloween, they got masks and everything and went around and scaring the black kids with the spirits and stuff. And I said, man, you shouldn't do that. And that's, you know, but he just wanted to have some fun, he said. Of course, they give him good as he sins. But anyway, good magic and bad magic. Black magic, white magic, same thing. Divinations, foretelling using dead animals, signs in the heavens. If you study the Greek religions, which we won't do that in this class, they had people that with the Roman armies and the temples, before, like I said, they would go into battle, they would read the internals of an animal to determine whether they should fight or not. So many a battle had been determined by how the animals' insides were set up. They would divinely seek the spirit world to get an answer. You know, Jews, and I'm just going to throw this out here, Jews, in a way, do this. You ever heard of the Urim and the Thummim? How many of you ever heard of Urim and the Thummim? I know you have. All right, and the priest, he had a breastplate on called the ephod. And in his in his left pocket, there was a pocket on just above his heart. And it had two stones in it, a white one and a black one. And when there were tough decisions to make, the priest would pull the stones out, and depending on which one comes out without looking at it, the white representing good, or this should happen, and black representing, that's a simple way of looking at it. Over in the book of Acts, when they had to pick a disciple, they chose the same process and chose two stones, and they ended up with Mattathias to be the new disciple based on the stones. Brother Finley, you know what I'm talking about. And that's interesting to me. They trusted God, but they trusted in that God would pick which stone, would divinely pick the stone that was the right one. Now, have you ever played any games where you did that, you know? Or did you do that when you got married? Said, eeny, meeny, miny, mo? You did that? Barry said he did that. Yeah. They look for causes and design a cure which can help to heal or remove the perceived threat of evil. One of the things that the missionaries going into Africa discovered very quickly was they would run across diseases that could be cured with antibiotics, things like that. And once they started healing some of these sick natives, it was almost, they had the power now of the shaman, and they had a great influence, and it opened the door. But it's kind of like Peter and John in the book of Acts, when they were healing people and stuff, people started worshiping them. And they said, don't do that. We're just human beings, and we're doing this in the name of Jesus. Okay, any questions so far on indigenous? Is that pretty clear to everybody? That's just some of the highlights. Okay, go to the next one there. All right, another thing about them, artifacts and artistic expression in indigenous religions. Pottery. Can you think of some other things? Maybe stone carvings. They leave behind in the ground things that were a part of their culture, drawings, animals. And if you dig up those areas, which now the grave sites hopefully won't be disturbed, but some of them have been, you'll find all kinds of artifacts. And they're very artistic with the things that they use to make the colors. African tribes do the same thing. Some of the other tribes in our country, in the world. Look at here, masks, drums, statues, rattles, and other objects are utilized in worship. Why do you think they would wear masks?
To be something that they weren't? To act like
To portray something, a bad spirit, or to scare something away, a white face or a red face. Do you know that our word hypocrite, that when we call somebody a hypocrite, comes out of Greek society? And whenever they had plays, they would have just a minimal number of actors to come on the stage that could act. And so they would carry different masks. And you might have one actor who plays the role of a happy person, so he'd come out with a happy face on. And then the next scene, he might come out with a sad face, or a male's face, or a female. So they didn't have as many actors, but they had masks. And the word for that is hypocritical or hypocritique. Somebody who's putting on the mask is what it literally means. So a hypocrite is somebody who puts on the mask. They say there's something and they're not. Well, most religions, to portray different feelings, different emotions, could wear those masks. Drums, statues, rattles, and other objects are utilized in worship. Drums, of course, if you watch a Florida State football game or a Kansas City Chief game, what do you hear? Or Atlanta Braves, for heaven's sakes. What do you hear going on? And why do they still get to do that and the Washington Redskins couldn't? What do they do? For the Florida State game, the Native American rides out on a horse with a flaming spear and right there in the middle. Y'all remember seeing that? I think that's one of the most awesome entrances in college football. And he throws it down, and then of course they start, beating the drum, boom, 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 boom. Well, the drums hopefully stir the spirit world and bring your ancestors and their spirits back into reality to help you be empowered to do what you've got to do. Now think about how drums are used today in the military. Everybody likes to see a band or hear a band, and when those drums get to play in a certain cadence and they come out, it's just something that stirs your emotions, Well, it's the same thing. To stir one's emotions, to get one prepped for whatever it is you're doing it. If it's a rain dance, if it's a war dance, the rhythm may change, but the drum is still there. To change it a little bit, Christians use bells. The African tribes use bells, and some of the European cultures use bells. Bells, with the clanging sound, making that noise, was supposedly keep the evil spirits away. And when the Catholic Church came into cultures where the bells were being used for that purpose and to draw people to their fake religious areas with the bells, the Christians took the bells and put music to them. And so since then, they've been a symbol of Christian worship, is to have bells playing music. That's why if you're in a city, most places, you have the big Catholic churches or Episcopal churches, sometimes Baptists, not many. They will have bells. But originally, the bells were used to scare spirits away. The drums were used to do that and to keep them away. So these indigenous groups used all those things, the rattles and the objects, the shaking, and all that. Artistic expressions, we already mentioned. Chants. Native Americans, we all probably as kids went around doing what? wear our mouths, you know. Did you do that, Wanda? Like, was you an Indian or what? A squaw, or was you a native? Oh, whatever brothers wanted her to be. Chants, ranting, raving, war chants, anything like that. Just a little bit of sidebar here. The northern part of England had a group of wild people to fight, and they fought the Romans, and they fought everybody before Britain actually became Britain. And these people would yell in times of conflict, scream and do yelling and stuff like that when they attack. Some of those people came and settled in the Scot-Irish in the southern portion of our country. The Native Americans were known for hooping and hollering and carrying on. When the Civil War started, the Confederate soldier borrowed from those cultures and used the rebel yell, and reading the diaries of the soldiers who heard them coming over the hill making that sound would strike fear in them to know that, and it might not be but 1,000 rebels versus 10,000 Yankees, but the very fact that back then you had one shot and then it was bayonet to bayonet and somebody was hooping and hollering 10 times louder than you, that war yell, the rebel yell as they call it, and I've heard it done different ways, comes from a lot of this culturally. So the voice, the inflection of the voice, the loud sounds and stuff. I mentioned totem poles. They are found in many indigenous groups. Feathers, birds were seen as messengers between the spirit world and here. So you saw the feathers on their hats. And a chief would have more feathers, which would signify he had more contact with the Great Spirit. Because the more the feathers, the longer you're living, the more power you have, and the more symbolic of your awareness of the spirit world. Few feathers on your head, if it was an eagle's feather, I guess the better it'd be eagle than maybe a hawk. But in either case, the feathers were symbolic of the spirit world flying back and forth like messengers between the gods. And so those who were in leadership. Nature symbols, trees, mountains, water, fire, all of those things. It could be that. All right, any questions? Because I think, we still got one more. Oh, okay. Well, we got about 4 minutes. Is that about right? I'm looking at the clock behind your head. About 4 minutes. All right, indigenous religions today, okay? Do y'all know of any Native American tribes still practicing Native American religion on a regular basis, other than for tourists? How many of you have been to Cherokee and actually seen a dance done by so-called descendants of the Cherokees? How many of you have been to the thing in the mountains called Unto These Hills? Pretty impressive. The Trail of Tears is what it's about. I think Gil said it was boring. I liked it, but of course I knew the story. The dances, and some of they do that for tourism more than anything else, but some of it goes back to, the beating of the drums and the hop and skipping and the clothes that they wear. There is some comeback. In some places, they're not flourishing at all. Out west, you might find some areas around the reservations. The reservations were a good and bad thing for Native Americans. Why do you think it was a good thing? Their own law, they was able to keep their own culture. They had their own police force. They had their own schools. They had their own gambling casinos. That was one thing. I mean, I've never understood that, but they're a nation within a nation is what they're supposed to be. Now, when they were first started, they were to get them out of our hair from the east to the west, and also get them out of the west. In fact, the Native Americans that left North Georgia and North Carolina and western South Carolina, that area there, the Cherokee Hills, when they sent those Native Americans out west, they ended up in an area right there in Oklahoma called Broken Arrow. I don't know if you've ever been there. It's a campground. And that's where they ended up. But there were other tribes came there too, and they all blended right there. And they cleaned them out here because gold had been found in the northern hills of North Georgia, and guess what? People wanted it. And so they moved them off their territory so they could mine their places. Yeah. That's right. And real quickly, and we'll finish with this. And I read so much about Custer. When Custer first went out west after the Civil War, he was sent by the federal government with 1,000 people in an expedition to mark out the area where they were going to let, some more area be given to the Native Americans. But at the time, it was owned by the Native Americans. It was their territory, the Dakotas. Anyway, long story short, they went out there. This is the first trip. They was out there for almost 6 months. I don't know how long it was. And while they were there, they found gold. Well, immediately they came back to Washington and petitioned Washington to give that land back, to open it up to people going west because of the gold. And that was at a time when, after the war, when Grant was administration and they were ripping everybody off and the government was going through a depression. I mean, they needed gold. And they gave them the green light. But to get them out of there, they had to create a disturbance. You fill in the rest of the story. And things changed. And of course, they eventually got the gold, run them out of there. And it's just been a lot of things. And I'm not trying to defend hostility. I'm just saying, when you get the whole story, it changes how you look at things. It did, it did for me. And anyway, 4 reasons for their demise: global spread of popular culture. There you go. Europeans came to America. America went across America. Same thing in Africa. Loss of natural environments, pushed out of areas that was their habitat. Loss of traditional languages. I don't know if anybody I've ever heard speak Cherokee. I don't even know what it sounds like. I've watched TV. They say they're speaking, what is it, Apache or Comanche or whatever, and I don't know if they are or not. Conversion to other religions, and that's probably one of the biggest ones. When the colonists came to the shores of America, like you said, the tribes were fighting tribes a lot of times, they converted these Indians, tried to Christianity, and make them like us. Well, to do that, they had to basically give up their gods, give up their beliefs and everything else. And good or bad, same thing with Africa. There's some good things in every religion, but we see Christianity as being the true religion. But when you force somebody to do something instead of leading them, that's where you run into problems. And I'll tell you this, people believe in their God. They'll fight you. If you don't think so, mess with an Islamic person and try to tell them Allah doesn't exist. And they just soon kill you, because according to the Quran, they can. Now, we don't feel that way, but we feel very adamant about it. And there's been times in history when the Christians would kill you if you tried to stop them with the Crusades. So, needless should I say, religion plays a very powerful force in our belief system. All right, we'll move ahead next week. Don't pay any attention to those numbers up there. That was in their book for homework, so you don't have that one. But we'll move ahead for our next section. Any questions on the indigenous religions? Anything maybe you heard or want to add? Or any of you got Native American in you, in your family tree? Anybody? You do? How many generations back? 2? Okay. She does?
Yeah, but it's way back there.
What tribe is it?
Cherokee.
Okay.
You go up to Cherokee in North Carolina, if you look at the mailbox, you'll see a lot of Maines up there.
Really? And a lot of the Native Americans, once they blended into the culture, took on American names too. That was another thing with Africans. When they came from Africa, they had an African name, but when they got here and became slaves, they took the name of their masters and, family name and stuff like that. Do what?
His great-great-great-grandma was full-blooded.
Well, my granddaddy, Johnny Walker, he said that his mother was, I never saw her. I saw a picture of his sister. His sister looked like a Cherokee squaw with a short black hair, and she's kind of round, and and I often tell Grandpa, I said, well, what was great-grandpa thinking about when he decided to go get with a Cherokee squaw?
They got looks of her and all. She looks like an old mountain man instead of.
She didn't. His sister didn't look that way. I told him, I said, what did your mama look like? He said, about like that. I said, man, what was great-grandpa thinking? He should have, when he crossed by that teepee, he should have just kept on trucking, so maybe next time. Because I tell you what, now I'm going to tell you this, health-wise, if you've got Cherokee in your bloodstream, you've got some issues, and I've done the homework on it, and they go along with the two cultures.
You can hear her out in the street.
Oh, who, Nellie? Yo, you still talking?
About that whole, what you call it, war cry.